Thank you for the introduction. For those of you I have never met, my name is Debra Briddell. I'm the grants officer for the North Central cluster, or the states that I'm assigned to. Since some of you have already submitted questions in advance, we'll use those as some of the most pressing issues that you have related to senior court budget preparation to get started. However, if there are some additional questions, we'll try to address them as we go along. The first question that we received was, it would be nice to clarify the use of the excess column. I believe that some programs only report federal grant and the match, so would not be using the excess column. What are the advantages of reporting your whole budget and using the excess column? Any disadvantages? What happens during a review? Will the excess column be included or ignored? The short answer is the excess column is used to track unallowable costs. However, some of our programs report non-federal match.
Excuse me, this is Rebecca. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm getting huge echoes. Is anybody else?
I do hear that echo in the background.
Really bad.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Does someone have us on mute or hold?
I think it might be the phone line.
Okay. Is that better? Okay.
Yeah, let's try that.
All right. I'll step back a moment. The excess column is used primarily to track any unallowable costs for your program. However, some of our programs also track excess non-federal match in that column. However, we encourage our grantees to report all allowable match in the non-federal share. And some programs may be tracking other federal or non-restricted funding in the excess column. But it's primarily used, the purpose of it is to track unallowable costs. And the next question that we received is as follows. On what basis do we decide to do an indirect cost rate or not? How much detail is needed? As an example, it's hard to budget for a regional conference next year when we don't know where it will be, which impacts costs of travel, etc. We have the same situation with the state volunteer conference and others, so the best we can do is some general estimate. Also, knowing where certain items should be listed in the budget document and how they should be broken out. Well, for starters, a regional conference is not considered an indirect cost. That would be a direct cost to your CNCS grant. Indirect costs are costs that are not attributable to a specific funding source, such as IT or human resources, things of that nature. And it would depend on your sponsoring agency whether or not they felt like they were recouping their indirect costs. If they don't feel that they're recouping those indirect costs, they can either negotiate a federal indirect cost rate or choose to adopt the 10% de minimis rate, and however that rate is only available to non-federal entities who have never applied for indirect costs. The next question I have here is, can mileage reimbursement be paid to a volunteer for travel to and from their home to the volunteer station site, or is it only made available when a volunteer uses their own vehicle in providing the services, such as providing transportation or delivering food? Is there any distinction between the two, or does it just matter upon the written policy of that RSVP program? The short answer is volunteer reimbursement is available to the volunteers for service-related travel, assuming that you have enough in your budget to accommodate travel reimbursement.
But then you're saying not as a commute to their station.
If it's service-related transportation, yes. If it's service-related to and from their home for service-related transportation, you can reimburse the volunteers.
Okay.
Or if the volunteer is the carpool driver, that volunteer will only be reimbursed.
Right.
Are there any other questions? Before we move on to the last question that we have.
Deborah?
On the CNCS budget of $80,515, we received $36,017 from the state. The funds from the state more than meet the required match. We have been instructed to place the $36,017 in the grantee share. Should we be placing just the required match in the grantee share and the remainder in the excess column? We recommend that any allowable match, even if it's over and beyond the non-federal match requirement, be reported in the non-federal match or grantee share. Unallowable costs should be tracked in the excess column, or any other unrestricted funds that you have. Does that help? Okay.
I just want to follow up on one.
Sure.
The specific to the providing mileage to and from their home. That would be true as with RSVP as well as the stipended programs?
Yeah, that's correct.
That's their policy?
One little caveat here. We do not recommend that your agency reimburse above the federal reimbursement rate for mileage.
Each current federal year, like right now, it's 54 cents.
Yes.
So no higher than anything higher than that is which we don't do anything higher than that, but why would someone do higher than that, Deborah?
I don't know, but many programs have different policies and procedures. We don't recommend it because that might be considered income by the Internal Revenue Service.
Right. Yep. I always point them to that IRS publication 525 as far as the mileage, which means that you have to make sure that you're following that guideline. Otherwise, it is considered mileage, or it is considered reimbursement, and you got a 1099 them on them.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question. This is Rebecca about mileage for reimbursement for
Sure.
RSVP staff. Should that be paid out at the federal mileage amount, or what if your expense here for what they pay out for the sponsoring agency?
It really varies based on how you proposed it in your approved budget.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another mileage question here for Debra.
Sure.
Debra, can you set up a policy that provides mileage only for those volunteers that are using their own vehicles to provide the service? As an example, providing transportation for homebound elderly to doctor appointments, etc. And can you set up a policy and limit it to that restricted group only that's using their vehicle, again, for providing the volunteer service, no matter what it is? Maybe they're transporting food or whatever to the food pantry, but they're using their vehicle. Is that acceptable to do something like that?
We have been on site on compliance monitoring visits, and we saw distinctions in the policies and procedures that distinguish mileage reimbursement for personally owned vehicles and public transportation. So there should be a distinction between the different forms of reimbursements.
Okay, so you could maybe just do that, but disallow any other kind of, like going from your home to, let's say, the hospital to volunteer. but limited to just that or specific group of volunteers.
I'm not sure I understand that last part of that question. Can you rephrase it?
Yes. So again, all these people are using their vehicles to get to the volunteer site, but others are using their vehicle to maybe, I don't know, deliver building supplies for Habitat for Humanity using their own vehicle. So if you wanted to have your money go as far as it can to do the most good, and you said, well, we're going to provide the reimbursement only for volunteers who use their vehicle for the volunteer service, not to get back and forth to the volunteer station, but using their vehicles in service of providing the volunteer work.
But isn't that all of it is service-related transportation, isn't it?
That's what I was thinking, when they leave their house to go and volunteer wherever they're going, and it's all service-related.
Right,
Okay,
so I don't think you want to make a distinction like that, because you will have to we would call in to question the rationale behind your policy.
Okay, so and I just want to make sure then, so I can't distinguish between the volunteer driving to the hospital to volunteer versus the driver that's, delivering meals using their own vehicle or whatever. Both are considered service-related travel. Is that correct?
Right. So I would say that a policy should make a distinction between personally owned vehicle transportation, public transportation, and I'm not sure if there are any other forms at your agency, but those are two typical scenarios that we see when we look at policies and procedures.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's been very helpful.
Yeah, because you want to make sure that you're fair in your policies and procedures with all the volunteers.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. So if we could hold some of the questions so we can move on, and we'll try to entertain any others that you might have as we go along. Are we missing something here? Oh, okay, there we go. Here we go. All right. Both the budget narrative and the budget and the budget narrative become part of the awardee's contract with CNCS, which is why we expect applicants to present a strong and accurate budget. The notice of funding announcement will spell out the contractual obligation. The approved budget serves as a financial guide for grant-supported activities and helps to ensure compliance with the terms and conditions of the award. In addition to helping CNCS monitor grant and financial compliance, it can serve as a tool for both CNCS and the awardee to measure progress toward the match requirements. It also helps to monitor budgeted expenses to actual as part of the budget process. And it helps to ensure that your drawdowns are aligned with your immediate needs. A well-defined, developed budget can be a roadmap to help achieve programmatic and financial objectives of the award. The federal laws and regulations you should become familiar with in 2 CFR, or the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. That defines the factors that determine the costs as allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable. That regulation replaced the individual circulars back in December 26, 2014. And many people refer to it as the super circular or uniform guidance. CNCS regulations and programmatic and fiscal are based on the Code of Federal Regulations, CNCS grant terms and conditions, and notice of funding announcement are part of the grant award. All costs that are proposed in the budget are based on the selected item of costs indicated in the Code of Federal Regulations, and a cost that meets the criteria for authorized expenditures specified in the cost principle. For example, if you're in year 3 of your grant and you're responsible for writing the grant, a portion of your time should be allocated to the excess column for fundraising. Writing the new 3-year renewal grant is considered fundraising. Therefore, it's not an allowable cost towards the federal or non-federal share of the grant. And so if you're on a conference and you receive a parking citation, that would not be an allowable cost that you could charge to the grant. That would be something that you would have your accounting department charge to the excess column. A cost is allocable to the grant or a particular award or other cost objective if the goods or services involved are chargeable or assignable to that award. So essentially, if you have 2 senior corps programs and you have a recognition event for the senior companion and you have another event for the RSVP program, the cost associated with the recognition event for the RSVP program will not be allocable to the senior companion program. When it comes to reasonableness, we look to the prudent person rule. You would look to say whether would a prudent person purchase this item. Like, for example, use the conference again, regional conference again. If you're flying to the conference and instead of using a coach, you decide to have your flight upgraded to first class, that would be considered unreasonable. And we would definitely question a first class ticket.
Debra, this is Lynette. I just have a quick question on it, especially with all of the way that the airline changes now. Like if you go and try to make a flight and, they have no seats left, and I'm not talking first class, they have no seats left, in coach or whatever, now you got to pay $39 just to get a seat, still in coach, but because they call it a premium seat, there's not, nothing else left. I ran into that here on a personal flight that I was doing for myself, and then now that you brought that up, I thought, well, what happens then? That just made me think about that. What happens? How do we account for that when they're really, we either not take the flight, can't get there, or we have to pay the extra $39 just to, or $25, whatever they charge, just to get on the flight to get there.
With you.
Hello?
I'm still here. So I think someone has us on mute or hold.
Yeah, because we got music.
I think somebody put us on hold.
That might be another announcement we need to make to ask for everyone to not either step out of the room and not place us on hold out of respect for the rest of the participants.
Okay.
Thank you. Now, if I understood your question correctly, or you clarify that, are you being charged an extra fee, or is it because you're close in proximity to your departure? The rate is higher.
Oh, no, being charged the extra fee.
You're being charged an additional $39?
$25, whatever they charge, yeah.
And that's the only flight you can take?
And that's the only flight that's available, yeah.
Well, if it's, excuse me.
Bless you.
I apologize. It's hard to say whether that, without seeing the invoice, it's hard to say if that's an additional fee.
Yeah.
And it's a reasonable fee, and it's the only flight available. It's not a premium. If it's considered a premium seat, we might take exception to that. That would be considered a reasonable if another lower cost flight was available.
Right, and maybe I should have, that's probably the wrong example to use. I'll use the fee where they charge us for carrying your luggage, for checking a luggage.
Checking baggage is totally different. Now, if you're exceeding the $50, the 50 pounds, that's different. Yes,
right.
That's a penalty.
Okay.
That would be considered a penalty. I don't know that you would be able to charge that to our grant.
Yes, no, I don't carry that.
Even
I
as
do
employees,
carry on.
I'm sorry.
I do carry on because I don't want to wait at the gate.
Because even as employees, we cannot charge the premium. We make sure that we're under that weight limit so that we're only charged $25.
Yeah, but that $25 is allowable.
Yes, that's an allowable cost.
Got it. Thank you.
Yes. Are there any other questions before I move on? One other thing before I move to the next slide is it's important to remember that if a cost is unallowable as part of the CNCS share, it's also unallowable as part of the grantee share. Program and fiscal staff should work collaboratively on developing a budget. A strong budget design provides a framework for effective budget management and ensures a realistic scope, expects program revenues and expenses, and its capacity to carry out the program activities. It's consistently aligned with the program's goals and objectives, and the costs are consistently charged across all federal grants. A budget is flexible, should be flexible, and reflect the project's financial and operating circumstances that can often change, and must have a budget that can adapt to changing circumstances. Therefore, projected expenses for the year can be revised. Budget revisions 10% or more of the grant require prior approval. There are some other prior approval requirements, so I encourage you to become familiar with that section of the uniform guidance so that you'll know what those items are. And if we have time, I can give you that reference. And you want to make sure that your budget includes appropriate detail, and it's a competitive proposal. It's in compliance with the terms and conditions of the award, and it serves as a guide for executing your goals and objectives of the program. The strongest and most compliant budget narrative follows the instructions outlined in the Notice of Funding Opportunity and Applications Instructions, which often include minimum and maximum cost levels and notes the required line items. Adhering to the guidance now saves time and effort later. I want to reemphasize the need to become familiar with 2 CFR Part 200 because it defines the factors that determine the costs that are allowable, reasonable, necessary, and allocable. You and your team would estimate the financial resources you need to achieve the stated program goals and objectives. And then you would go by to organize them into the narrative of the budget, following the guidance in the Notice of Funding Opportunity and Application Instructions. As you develop the narrative, remember to provide adequate descriptions, including the basis of how you arrived at the proposed budget amounts. This should be able to serve as a standalone document without a need to reference the application narrative for explanation. Applicants may want to have someone outside the budget review team review the document to check for any holes or inaccuracy. You want to make sure that you review your budget and program objectives, goals and objectives, and estimate any resources that are needed to carry out the goals and objectives. And here are some examples: the staff, the space that would be needed, the number of volunteers, and any uniforms or training that are needed. And be sure to follow the instructions outlined in the Notice of Funding Opportunity and Notice of Funding Announcement or other guidance received by CNCS staff. And you want to ensure that the budget is organized by expense category outlined on the budget. And I'm just emphasizing the need to provide adequate detail in the budget narrative to support the amounts that are proposed in the budget. And if you're allocating costs, the cost should be based on a consistent and documented cost allocation plan. Examples include level of effort. That would be based on percentage of time spent on the activity times the salary. Rent, that would be total CNCS program space divided by the host agency space. Expenses, percentage of expenses for the program versus the total organization's expenses. This identifies how the CNCS budget structure is illustrated in the approved budget. Section 1 is comprised of all the volunteer support expenses. This is the section that represents your administrative costs to operate the program. Section 2 are all the volunteer expenses. These are the expenses that directly benefit the volunteer. And these are the three columns that you will see in a CNCS budget. You'll see the budget narrative in the far left-hand column, and that's where you will put the detail or basis of your calculations to support any expenses that you put in the CNCS grantee share or excess column. The excess column is optional unless you have your known unallowable costs. You can track those in that column. Many grantees use this column to capture grant expenditures that cannot be attributed to match anything deemed necessary but unallowable based on the cost principles. Again, if the staff performs fundraising, you must include salaries and fringe attributable to fundraising activities within the excess column. And your source of funds for excess column cannot be federal funds unless you receive it's allowable by legislation or authorized by the other federal awarding agency.
Could I just interrupt for a second and ask
Sure.
that we all put our phones on mute? We're hearing somebody doing some fine keyboarding. Thanks.
Thank you. The budget is separated into direct and indirect or administrative costs. The direct costs include program operating costs and member costs, which may include specific lines as those noted in the visual. Costs are charged directly. Those are costs that are charged directly to the grant. Indirect or administrative costs are those general or centralized organizational costs that are spread over the agency as a whole. Indirect means you cannot directly contribute or attribute the cost to the grant. As your agency develops their budget management systems, specifically the budget control process, that you will want to establish clear policies and procedures for tracking and documenting these expenses. This is a sample of typical expense line items in the section 1 of the budget. You will have your project personnel expenses, fringe, staff travel, and that typically is broken down into local and long distance travel. Equipment, that's usually a line item that is not used. Most of our senior corps program never meet the $5,000 threshold, so supplies are anything under $5,000. And contractual and consultant services would be those expenses that you have incurred and you have a contractual agreement with the vendor. And section I would be the other volunteer support costs in section 1. And indirect costs would be either your negotiated indirect costs or your 10% de minimis. And here's how it would be reflected in the typical budget narrative. You would see that this person is proposed in the budget at $35,000, the project director. Excuse me. And we're assuming here that this person does not have, let's assume that this is year 3. The way this is reflected, this person is not responsible for writing the new grant, the new 3-year grant. So this would be acceptable. So, however, if this person was responsible for writing the new 3-year grant, a portion of his or her time should be reflected here. Whatever percentage that is, 1 or 2%, it should be right here. And then the remaining part, the 95%, would be allocated between CNCS share and grantee share. And all of the personnel that are proposed in the budget must be agency staff, not contractors. And you must maintain time and activity documentation for each staff member that's listed in the budget. These are some standard fringe benefit costs that are common to, I'd say, 99% of CNCS budgets. The Social Security FICA, usually we expect to see the percentage shown there so that we can see that your calculation is consistent with the amounts that are proposed in the budget. And the health insurance, retirement, workman's comp, and unemployment. Just keep it simple. The description in the line item narrative should accurately reflect the total amount proposed in the budget. We prefer that you not use acronyms, always spell them out, and provide the institutional percentage or an actual cost to determine the benefit cost. If the benefit doesn't cover all staff and the personnel expense, indicate the staff that are covered, for example, for health insurance. It's only the project director and the volunteer coordinator. If for some reason you have maybe the executive director or some other staff member proposed in your budget in the personnel section. E-grants only accepts whole numbers, so round up or round down accordingly. And these are all for illustration purposes. Always indicate the number of miles and reimbursement rate so that if need be, we can provide you with guidance if we see some concerns. The mileage rate should not exceed the approved GSA or General Services Agency or federal approved mileage reimbursement rate for a personally owned vehicle. Travel must be program specific and not general in nature. Travel reimbursement should be based on your organization's travel policy. All senior corps grantees must budget for training for one staff person, primarily the project director You may budget for an additional staff member to attend training events if funds permit. The recommended amount for budgeting purposes, a minimum of $1,000 to attend a CNCS sponsored training. And that's just a threshold. If the training is not CNCS sponsored, you will need to get prior approval if using CNCS dollars. Include the number of staff or staff person attending the training. Oops, sorry about that. If budgeting to attend additional conferences or trainings, show each on a separate line item. Again, travel must be program specific and not general in nature, such as self-improvement courses. Training should be specific to managing the project and carrying out the goals and objectives. You must get prior approval before entering any equipment in the proposed CNCS budget. For the most part, as I said previously, senior core grantees never reach that $5,000 threshold, so that expense line item should always be blank unless you have received prior approval. And prior approval from a CNCS standpoint or legal standpoint would come in the form of a notice of grant award amendment, not an email from your grants officer or your program office. Supplies are basic office operating supplies, and they should be grouped together as we illustrate here. And you just give us an estimated cost or basis for the expenses that you have proposed in the budget. And also, if you're purchasing laptops or printers, it should be shown in the supply section and create a separate line item for each item that's being purchased. Program supplies or supplies used by volunteers while volunteering are unallowable, such as FGP, books, crayons, etc. should be supplied by the volunteer station. And SCP, crossword puzzles, games, etc. Those are things that should be typically provided by the volunteer station if it's necessary for them to carry out their service activities. And typically this illustrates the kind of expense activity that we see in the budget for payroll. If you've outsourced your payroll processing for the volunteers, and if your agency meets the A133 threshold, and how you allocated it to the program. One thing to remember here, if your agency does not meet the A133 threshold, you should not be charging audit costs to the grant. CNCS is considering some exceptions for our self-incorporated sponsors to make an exception for them, but that's a CNCS exception. That is not something that's indicated in the regulatory requirements. The regs state that if your agency does not meet the A133 threshold, which is $750,000 right now, you should not be charging audit costs to our grant.
And I'm sorry, what's the $750,000?
$750,000 in federal expenditures.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking for clarity around that. Okay. I'm going to start speeding up because it looks like we're running out of town, and we have about a number of slides that I want to make sure we cover. Most of this stuff you can refer to it in your leisure, but if I'm going too fast, please stop me. Again, this just illustrates the narrative, how it should be portrayed in your approved budget. One thing I will mention here is the criminal background check. for some reason, eGrants is preventing you from providing us with detail in the narrative. So what you would do is create a new line item so that you could put the necessary the cost per criminal background check in that narrative section. There are two methods to recoup your indirect costs. That's through a federally approved indirect cost rate or the de minimis rate. If the de minimis is something you're interested in, there is a form that we'd like you to submit to us indicating that your agency has never received the indirect cost rate so that we can ensure that you're even eligible to receive it. And I can give you that website to send that to, but first you would make contact with your program officer, and I can either give it to you or the website, I believe it's idcr@cncs.gov. That's the site that you would send that form to, but that form would be provided to you by the state office.
Could I ask, I know there have been some specific questions around indirect cost rates and the calculation of which. Does anybody have anything specifically they'd like to ask Debra? This would be a great time to do that.
Yeah, this is Janet.
Go ahead.
We've got several, as you know, but it almost feels like we're the only ones wrestling with this whole cost basis to calculate de minimis, and I don't want to hang up everybody else if they've got it down or aren't doing it. So I don't have a sense of, does everybody else already have an indirect cost rate so that they're not using de minimis? Or...
I think most people don't, Janet, but I can tell you there's been a lot of questions about whether or not people should and how it would be calculated. This might be a good opportunity unless people would prefer not to.
Or you can also send us questions after this call. Send us the questions that you have, and we'll respond individually.
It would be really great, Janet, if you might ask some of yours. I know that you've had some back and forth, but if you have some specific ones, that would be great.
Okay. So just starting like really foundationally to make sure, because we've gone round in circles on some things, so I think we've probably confused ourselves, but just to be overly basic. Some level of indirect costs can be charged to either the CNCS or the grantee share. The way we calculate how many indirect expenses can be allowed under CNCS or grantee share, we first have to figure out our direct cost, the allowable direct cost.
That's correct.
And then once that's done, we take 10% of that, and that's the maximum dollars of our indirect costs that can go either in the CNCS or the grantee share. Any other indirect costs above that would need to go in excess.
There are some costs that cannot be included in the de minimis cost rate.
Right.
And some of the de minimis cannot be applied to participant costs. That would be Section 2 costs.
Yep. So we got this great template that has columns aligning with the budget that tell us distinctly, yes, this can be a direct cost to factor your cost basis, and then it also tells us which things cannot be a part of your de minimis.
That's correct. I'm not quite sure how you got a hold of that calculator, because we're not supposed to share that with grantees, but it's fine. You're lucky. Consider yourself lucky having it in your possession.
Okay, great. Well, it's been somewhat helpful as long as we make sure we understand it. So even though, let me see, how can I ask the question? Let me look at some other notes.
we're going to entertain one more question because we have a number of more slides, but if you want to continue this conversation about indirect costs, I'll be happy to have a one-on-one conversation, or if anyone else has questions about indirect costs, I could have a one-on-one with you also. Go ahead, continue if you have a follow-up question related to indirect costs.
Yeah, how do we get a hold of you to have that conversation to figure this out?
Just send me a quick email and we can schedule some time. Sooner rather than later, because we're moving into the 4-1 grant cycle. 7-1 grant cycle. Uh-oh.
Janet, why don't we get...
Bear with me.
Let's get a time scheduled with Debra.
Sure, that sounds great.
I'm not oh, it's back. It's back. It looks like it was dying on me. Okay. I'm going to skip that field. That's just an illustration of the indirect costs that were proposed in the grant. Now we're moving on to section 2 of the budget. This is where you will find the volunteer expenses. The stipend payments are payments provided to the FGP and SCP volunteers for each hour of service. And the other volunteer costs represent the meals, uniforms, and essentially all the other expenses that are hard-coded into e-grants. You should not be adding any new expense line items to section 2, such as training. Training should be proposed in section 1, unless it's in-service training. You can have in-service training meals in section 2, not the training itself, but the meals.
Could you talk about allowable food costs, Debra?
That's a broad subject. Could you be specific?
So, for instance, can a budget include money for food at agency events or trainings, those sorts of things?
If it's not necessary to carry out the goals and objectives, you would have to definitely provide justification so that it wouldn't be caused into question. For example, I was on a compliance monitoring visit back in March, and I noticed that the program was purchasing meals for income reviews. That would be something that we would either question or ask the program to stop doing, because that's something that could be done during a regular in-service activity. You follow me? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Anyone else have specific questions around that? I know it's come up a few times.
Okay. All right.
What about like recognition events for volunteers? How does a recognition event, if there's a food provided for that, how does that work in the budget?
You should have the itemized invoice for the recognition event, as well as a sign-in sheet, so that we can see who attended that event and the cost per person, including if you're inviting guests. The recognition event is intended to recognize the volunteers. So if any guests are invited, they should be at cost, with the exception of special guests, such as like the mayor, the advisory council, or people of that nature. Now, the spouse or friends that might be invited, they would be at cost. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, now we're moving on to the volunteer service year. It's a budget term which equals 1,044 hours, or equates to 1,040 hours. You cannot pay more than $2.65 per hour, and that's in the regs. The volunteers are serving as a FGP or SCP volunteer is not a job. It's a volunteer opportunity. 1,044 times 265 equates to what you see in eGrants, 2,767. eGrants budget only is whole numbers. You would need multiple BS volunteers to contribute to equate to 1 BSY. And this is just another example of how the calculation is spelled out. I'm going to illustrate how, if you're having a BSY shortfall, because it's important to know that if you're having a BSY shortfall and it's at the end of a budget period, you have to leave the money that equates to that shortfall in your account. Otherwise, you will have to repay funds back to the corporation. For example, here, if you use this example of 26 BSYs, and that's your approved BSY level, if you have if you only achieve 24 BSYs, the amount of money that equates to that shortfall, which in this case would be $2,088 hours, or $5,533.20. That's how much you have to leave as unobligated on your FFR, so that you wouldn't have a collection action sent to your agency. And when we're on site for compliance monitoring, we reconcile the hours that you report on your FFR and your program progress report to the stipends that are recorded in your general ledger, and they should normally reconcile to the penny. I'm going to skip this section, and this again illustrates the typical expenses you'll see in the approved budget, the cost per volunteer, and the 3 different types of CMA insurance, and the volunteer meals there, and the volunteer travel and physical exams. Those are the only expenses that typically you find in Section 2 of the budget, with the exception of some programs are adding the in-service meals in that section, but they would be up here. And don't forget to complete this section, the source of funds. That should always be populated. Now for our RSVP grantees, if you're a brand new grantee, your match requirement is 10% in the first year, 20% in the second, and 30% in the third and succeeding years. And this is just an illustration of how you would calculate the non-federal match requirement. You're taking, if it's a $100 award and the 30%, you've already at that 30% match requirement, you would take the $100 divided by 0.70, and the match requirement less the $100, and you arrive at what the non-federal match requirement would be, which would be, in this case, $42.86. And here's another way of looking at it. For those of you that have a 30% match requirement, if you had a $40,000 award, you would take that factor here, and this would be the non-federal match requirement. And to check your math, you would take the $17,144 divided by what the CNCS award plus the grantee share, or commonly referred to as the total outlays, and you would arrive at the 30% match. Now we're moving into the same type of scenario for FGP and SCP, and there's this 10% match requirement. One other caveat for the foster grandparent and senior companion grant requirements, they have a direct benefit ratio requirement of 80%. You have to be on target at 80% when at the end of each budget period. Otherwise, there may be funds that your agency will have to return to the corporation at the end of the 3-year performance period. And here's an illustration of the the match calculation for FGP or SEP program that had a 10% match. It's just another way of illustrating how you would achieve that. And here's how we normally would look at your budget summary. We would take the section 2 subtotal divided by the CNCF share amount to see if you're on target for achieving that budget, the volunteer direct benefit ratio when your budget comes in for review. So essentially what we're doing when your budget comes into us is making sure there are no unallowable costs in the grant, and that you have presented a clear budget that has the basis of all the expenses proposed in the budget. And we're verifying that you're on target for meeting your non-federal match, your volunteer direct benefit ratio, and we also double check to make sure there were no miscalculations in the VSYs that are proposed in the grant. Here are some typical unallowable costs that are in the selected item of cost: entertainment, fines and penalties. There may be more, but it's imperative that you become familiar with the selected items of cost and other regulatory requirements included in the uniform guidance. If you haven't already done so, I recommend that you download a copy of it or bookmark that reference so that you can easily refer to it at your leisure when it's necessary to verify which costs were allowable, which costs require prior approval. And here's an illustration of some unallowable costs on here, but unfortunately it's 12:03, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So we can go through this if people have a few more minutes. Otherwise, I will have to end the call because I want to be respectful to everyone's time.
Let me just add that Debra has offered to put all the slides in a PDF and send them out. But if folks would like to stick around, that would be great.
Is that okay?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. Now, I'll give you a few minutes to take a look at this slide and identify some of the unallowable stuff that you see here. And this is maybe you're at a regional conference, and if you could identify the things that you would not be able to charge to the grant.
How about that fancy car?
Exactly, it's a convertible. That's one of them.
The whiskey, the ticket, and the ticket.
Yes, the Elvis tickets would be entertainment, and the whiskey was expressly unallowable. Both entertainment and alcohol is expressly unallowable. There's a little caveat for the entertainment: it must require prior approval of the awarding agency. So if you're considering some form of entertainment, you have to check with your program officer and grants officer to ensure that it's something that would be allowable. It's rare, but we're willing to entertain the conversation. Are there any others that you see?
The policeman giving you that ticket, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think we covered. I can't see. Now, bear with me. Let me go back to that one. I think we covered most of them there. Okay, let's see how much. This is just reiterating some key things, making sure that you keep, you submit your A-133 if you're required to file one to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, or your 990 if you're required to file one, and making sure that your CCR registration is active throughout the performance period of your grant, and you would update that at sam.gov. and just verifying that you can proceed with in e-grants, you receive flags or incorrect entries with warnings and error messages. Just recognize those, and if you have difficulties, you can contact the National Services Help Desk for e-grants. And it's helpful to have that ticket number available for either to share with your program officer if you're having technical difficulties, or you can forward it to your grants officer. But your primary point of contact is your program officer. And these are some helpful links. The nationalservice.gov is a location that you can find some of the online courses, and you can also find the uniform guidance there. If you type in the keyword uniform guidance when you go to the Knowledge Network at that site. And sam.gov is where you would update your CCR, and GuideStar is where your 990 would be located. And this is just another that's taking you directly to the uniform guidance on the nationalservice.gov. And I believe this site, the step-by-step guidance, shows you how to enter your budget in e-grants. So I hope everybody found this session helpful, and by all means, let us know if there was something that we did not address here that you would like to see in future training sessions, or if you have any other questions that you didn't feel comfortable posing here, reach out to either your program officer or myself, and we'll ensure that those questions are addressed.
Debra, thank you so much. And once again, everybody, you should feel free to reach out with lots of detailed questions that you have. And a few of these, we're going to set up a few calls with Debra to do one-on-ones. If there are other questions, you certainly can email them to Debra and us. Really appreciate everybody's time this morning.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks.